Our final story takes us deep into the Canadian wilderness, to Algonquin Provincial Park in Ontario. 3 million acres of pristine forest, pristine lakes, and something else. Something that the park rangers don't like to talk about, something that's been stalking the tree lines for longer than anyone cares to remember. In October 1989, 6 friends from Toronto decided to spend their Halloween weekend camping in the park's backcountry. They were all experienced outdoorsmen, hunters, hikers, and camping enthusiasts who knew the wilderness like their own backyards. What happened to them over those 3 days would challenge everything they thought they knew about the natural world. The group consisted of Mark Stevens, a 34-year-old contractor and the unofficial leader, his younger brother Danny, 29, a teacher with a passion for wildlife photography, Tommy Rodriguez, 31, an ex-military man who'd served in Bosnia, Sarah Chen, 28, a nurse, and the only woman in the group who could outshoot and outtrack any of the men, Jake Morrison, 26, fresh out of college and eager to prove himself, and finally, Pete Williams, 32, a quiet man who worked as a park ranger in Killarney and knew the Ontario wilderness better than anyone. They'd planned a 3-day hunting trip to a remote section of the park, accessible only by canoe and a 5-mile hike through dense forest. Pete had chosen the location, a valley called Whispering Pine Hollow, that he claimed held the biggest deer population in the park. What Pete didn't tell them was that Whispering Pine Hollow also had the highest number of missing persons reports filed against it, and that no park ranger would venture there alone, especially not in October. They set out from the Canoe Lake access point on October 28, 1989, under a gray sky that threatened snow. The weather was unusually cold for late October, with temperatures dropping well below freezing even during the day. But the 6 friends were well equipped and experienced, and they looked forward to a weekend away from the city's noise and stress. The first sign that something was wrong came during their hike into the valley. Danny, who was documenting the trip with his camera, noticed that the forest was completely silent. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, no insect noise, nothing but the sound of their boots crunching through the dead leaves. "This isn't normal," Sarah whispered as they paused for a rest. As a frequent hiker, she knew that healthy forests were never this quiet, even in late fall. Pete nodded grimly. "Been like this for the past few years. Game wardens think it might be a predator moving through the area, but we've never found any tracks or scat that would suggest what kind." "What kind of predator could clear out an entire valley?" Tommy asked, his military training making him automatically scan the tree line for threats. "That's what we're trying to figure out," Pete replied, though something in his voice suggested he knew more than he was saying. They reached their campsite just as the sun was setting, a small clearing beside a pristine lake that reflected the surrounding pine trees like a mirror. It should have been beautiful, but there was something oppressive about the place, something that made them all speak in whispers without quite knowing why. Mark and Danny set up their tent on the north side of the clearing, while Tommy and Jake pitched theirs to the south. Sarah and Pete took the spots closest to the lake, where they'd have easy access to water. By the time they had their camp established and a fire burning, full darkness had fallen. That's when they heard it for the first time. It started as a low humming sound, almost musical, drifting across the lake from the forest on the opposite shore. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, like a lullaby sung by angels, but there was something underneath it that made their skin crawl. "What the hell is that?" Jake whispered, his face pale in the firelight. Pete was staring across the lake with an expression of pure terror. "We need to leave. Right now." "Leave?" Mark laughed nervously. "We just got here. It's probably just wind through the trees or something." But Pete was already packing his gear. "That's not wind. That's... Look, there are stories about this place. Stories the Park Service doesn't like to publicize. People go missing here, Mark. Good people. Experienced people. and they all report hearing that sound before they disappear. The humming grew louder, more complex, as if multiple voices had joined the first. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, and despite their fear, the 6 friends found themselves drawn to it, wanting to move closer to the lake's edge to hear it better. "No," Pete said sharply, grabbing Sarah's arm as she took a step toward the water. "Don't listen to it. Don't move toward it. That's how it gets you." "How? What gets you?" Danny demanded, but Pete just shook his head. "We're leaving first thing in the morning," he said. "This was a mistake." But they wouldn't get the chance to leave? The humming stopped abruptly at exactly midnight, leaving a silence so complete it seemed to press against their eardrums. Then, from the forest around their camp, came the sound of footsteps. Not animal footsteps, human footsteps, dozens of them, circling their camp just beyond the reach of their firelight. Tommy grabbed his rifle and moved to the edge of the clearing. "Who's out there?" he called. "Identify yourselves!" The footsteps stopped. For several long minutes, they sat frozen around their campfire, straining to hear any sound from the darkness beyond. Then Jake screamed. Something had grabbed him from behind and was dragging him backward into the forest. The others could see it in the firelight. A tall, impossibly thin figure dressed in what looked like tattered clothing. Its face was hidden in shadow, but its arms were far too long, extending down past its knees, and it moved with an unnatural, jerky gait like a marionette controlled by a drunk puppeteer. Tommy and Mark rushed forward, but Jake and his captor had already vanished into the tree line. They could hear Jake screaming somewhere in the darkness, his voice growing fainter and fainter until it was swallowed completely by the forest. "Jake!" Sarah shouted, starting to run toward the trees, but Pete tackled her to the ground. "You can't help him," Pete said, his voice breaking. "If you go into the forest, you're dead too." "What are those things?" Danny whispered, his camera forgotten in his hands. Pete's face was white with terror. The Ojibwe called them the Wendigo's children, spirits of people who died in the forest and were consumed by hunger and madness. They hunt in packs, and they're always hungry. As if summoned by his words, more figures emerged from the tree line. Tall, impossibly thin, their limbs too long and joints bending in ways that human joints shouldn't bend. They moved in perfect unison, surrounding the camp, their faces hidden in shadow, but their eyes glowed with a cold, hungry light. "Stay by the fire," Pete commanded. "They can't cross running water or open flame. As long as we keep the fire burning, we're safe." But their safety was an illusion. As the night wore on, the creatures grew bolder, venturing closer to the fire's edge. And worse, they began to speak. At first, it was just whispers, too faint to understand. But gradually the whispers became clearer, and the friends realized with growing horror that the creatures were speaking in Jake's voice. "Help me," Jake's voice called from the darkness. "I'm hurt. They let me go, but I'm lost. I can't find the camp." "That's not Jake," Pete said firmly. "Jake is dead. They're trying to lure us out." But the voice was so convincing, so desperate, that Mark actually took a step toward the tree line before Tommy grabbed him. "Please," Jake's voice pleaded. "I'm bleeding. I need help. Sarah, you're a nurse. You have to help me." Sarah was crying now, her hands pressed over her ears. "Make it stop. Please make it stop." But it didn't stop. All night long, Jake's voice called to them from the darkness, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, sometimes screaming in what sounded like terrible pain. And gradually, other voices joined in, voices of people who had gone missing in these woods over the years, all of them begging to be rescued, all of them promising that they were safe, that the creatures had let them go. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. As the first gray light of morning filtered through the trees, the creatures melted back into the forest like shadows fleeing the sun. The unnatural silence returned, and for a moment the 4 survivors thought their nightmare was over. They were wrong. When they went to break camp, they discovered that their canoes had been destroyed, not just damaged, but completely shredded, as if something with enormous claws had torn them apart in a rage. Their backpacks had been rifled through, their food scattered and spoiled, their water contaminated with what looked like blood. "We'll have to hike out," Mark said, though his voice lacked conviction. It was a 5-mile hike through dense forest to reach the main trail, and they all knew that the creatures would be waiting for them. "They're hurting us," Tommy said quietly. "This is what they do. They isolate you, cut off your escape routes, and then they hunt you." Pete nodded grimly. "The Park Service knows about this place, but they can't close it without causing a panic, so they just minimize the reports, list people as missing instead of dead. Sometimes hikers' bodies turn up miles away, weeks later, looking like they died of exposure or wild animal attacks." "But you brought us here anyway?" Danny demanded. Pete's shoulders sagged. I thought maybe if we came in a group, if we were well armed and experienced, maybe we could survive it. Maybe we could even document what's happening here and force the authorities to take action." "So we're bait," Sarah said flatly. "We're all bait," Pete replied. "Every person who comes to these woods is bait. The question is whether we're smart enough to survive." They began their hike out just after sunrise, moving in tight formation with Tommy and Mark taking point and rear guard positions. The forest was still unnaturally quiet, but they could feel eyes watching them from the shadows between the trees. The first attack came just after noon. Danny was documenting their route with his camera when something exploded out of a stand of pine trees and slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. The others caught a glimpse of pale, mottled skin and 2 long limbs before the creature dragged Danny into the underbrush. This time, they gave chase. They found Danny's camera first, its lens cracked and the film exposed. Then they found his jacket, torn and bloody, hanging from a tree branch 20 feet off the ground. Finally, they found Danny himself. He was alive, but barely. The creature had suspended him from a tree, wrapped in what looked like spider silk but felt like human hair. His eyes were open, but he was catatonic, unresponsive to their voices or touch. As they worked to cut him down, Danny suddenly began to speak, but the voice that came out of his mouth wasn't his own. It was Jake's voice, speaking in a flat, emotionless monotone. "Don't try to save him. He's already gone. We're all gone. The forest takes everyone eventually." Mark slapped Danny across the face, and his brother's own voice returned, confused and terrified. Where am I? What happened?" They managed to get Danny down and moving, but he was clearly in shock, mumbling incoherently about the hungry ones and the long sleep. Worse, his body temperature was dropping rapidly, despite the mild October weather. By late afternoon, they were hopelessly lost. The trails that Pete knew like the back of his hand seemed to have shifted, leading them in circles or ending abruptly at impassable ravines that shouldn't have existed. The forest itself seemed to be actively working against them, branches catching at their clothes, roots rising up to trip them, and always the sense that they were being watched by hungry eyes. That's when they made a horrible discovery. Sarah, who had been helping support Danny, suddenly stopped walking and pointed ahead with a trembling hand. "Look," she whispered. There, hanging from trees in a small clearing, were dozens of cocoons made from that same hair-like substance they'd found Danny wrapped in. Some were old and empty, swaying gently in the wind. Others were fresh, and through the translucent material, they could see shapes inside human shapes. "Oh God," Mark breathed. "How many people have they taken?" Pete was counting under his breath. 30. 40, Jesus, there must be 50 of them. That's when they heard Jake's voice again, but this time it wasn't coming from the creatures hidden in the forest. It was coming from one of the cocoons. Mark, is that you? I'm in here, I'm trapped, please get me out." Mark started toward the cocoon, but Tommy grabbed his arm. "That's not Jake." "How do you know?" "Because Jake is right there," Tommy said, pointing to another cocoon 20 feet away. Through the translucent material, they could clearly see Jake's face, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling with slow, shallow breaths. The Jake voice laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Smart, soldier boy. But it doesn't matter. You're all gonna join us soon enough. The forest is hungry, and it's been so long since we've had fresh meat." More voices began calling out from the cocoons, dozens of them, all pleading to be rescued, all claiming to be the real person trapped inside. But when the survivors looked carefully, they could see that many of the cocoons contained the same people multiple times. 3 different cocoons held what looked like Jake. 4 contained someone who might have been Danny, though Danny was standing right beside them, shivering and mumbling. "They're not people anymore," Pete said quietly. "They're echoes, copies. The real people are gone, but something is using their forms, their voices." "Then what happened to Jake?" Sarah asked. "The real Jake?" Pete pointed to one of the older cocoons where something that had once been human was visible through the deteriorated material. It was mummified, desiccated, as if every drop of moisture had been sucked from its body. "The creatures feed slowly," he explained. "They keep their prey alive for weeks, maybe months, draining them bit by bit, and while they're feeding, they absorb them, learn to mimic them perfectly." As if summoned by his words, the creatures began emerging from the forest around the clearing. Dozens of them, all impossibly tall and thin, all wearing the faces of people who had gone missing in these woods over the years. Some faces were recent, clear, and detailed. Others were older, distorted, as if the creature's ability to maintain the illusion faded over time. "Run," Pete whispered. They ran. Through the darkening forest they crashed, branches tearing at their clothes, roots trying to trip them at every step. Behind them came the sound of pursuit, not just footsteps, but that horrible humming, growing louder and more complex as more voices joined the chorus. Danny collapsed first. The shock and whatever the creatures had done to him had sapped his strength, and he simply couldn't go any further. Mark tried to carry his brother, but the added weight slowed them down too much. "Leave me," Danny gasped. "Save yourselves." "Like hell," Mark replied. But even as he said it, he could see the creatures gaining on them through the trees. That's when Tommy made a decision that saved the others but doomed himself. The ex-soldier turned and raised his rifle, opening fire on the pursuing creatures. His shots were accurate. He'd been trained by the best, but the bullets seemed to have no effect. The creatures kept coming, flowing around the trees like living shadows. "Go!" Tommy shouted. "I'll hold them off as long as I can." The last thing the others heard as they ran was Tommy's voice, no longer defiant, but screaming in terror and agony. Then even his screams were drowned out by that horrible, beautiful humming. Mark, Sarah, Pete, and the barely conscious Danny stumbled through the forest for hours, guided only by Pete's desperate hope that he could find a way out. The creatures followed at a distance now, no longer rushing their attack. They were patient they could afford to be. Their prey was exhausted, lost, and running out of options. Just when all hope seemed lost, Pete spotted something through the trees. A flicker of artificial light. A campfire. They burst into a clearing where a family was camping, a middle-aged couple and their teenage son, all looking up in alarm as 4 strangers crashed out of the forest. "Thank God," Sarah sobbed. "We need help. There are things in the forest. They took our friends." The family looked at them with concern and confusion. The father, a kind-faced man in his 50s, stood up from the campfire. "Easy there," he said. "You folks look like you've had a rough time. Why don't you sit down, catch your breath, and tell us what happened?" As Pete began to explain their situation, Mark noticed something that made his blood run cold. The family's camping gear was old-fashioned canvas tents instead of modern nylon. A campfire setup that looked like it belonged in the 1950s, and clothes that seemed decades out of date. "What year is it?" Mark asked suddenly. The family exchanged glances. "Why, it's 1962, of course," the father replied. "October 30th, 1962. Sarah grabbed Mark's arm. "That's impossible. It's 1989. The teenage son laughed. 1989? That's crazy talk, lady. That's like 27 years in the future." That's when Pete understood. "We need to leave, right now." "But these people can help us," Sarah protested. "These people are dead," Pete said flatly. "They've been dead for 27 years. As if his words had broken some kind of spell, the family's appearance began to change. Their kind faces became gaunt and hollow, their eyes sank back into their skulls, and their clothes began to rot and fall away from their bodies. "You can't leave," the father said, his voice now a hollow whisper. "You've seen too much. You know about the forest secrets. You have to stay. You have to join us." The creatures were emerging from the tree line again, dozens of them, surrounding the clearing. But now Mark could see them clearly in the firelight, and he realized with growing horror that they weren't separate entities at all. They were all connected, like parts of a vast organism, linked by tendrils of that hair-like substance that pulsed with a sickly light. At the center of the web sat something that had once been human, but had long since become something else entirely. It was ancient, its body twisted and elongated, its face a mockery of human features. This was the source of the humming, the controlling intelligence behind the creatures. "The hunger," Pete whispered. "It's the hunger itself." The thing at the center of the web spoke without moving its lips, its voice echoing inside their heads. "I have been patient," it said. "For centuries I have been patient, taking only what I need to survive. But you have brought me something special. You have brought me knowledge of the world beyond these woods. Through you I can expand, I can spread." Mark felt something cold touch his mind. Tendrils of alien thought probing at his memories, absorbing everything he knew about the modern world, about cities and technology and the millions of people living beyond the forest's edge. "No," he said, fighting against the mental intrusion. "You can't. You won't." But it was too late. The thing had what it wanted. Through Mark's memories, it now knew about highways and airplanes, about urban centers where thousands of people lived in close proximity. It knew about the modern world's isolation, how people could disappear in cities just as easily as they could in forests. "Thank you," the hunger said, and Mark felt his mind being pushed out, replaced by something else. "Your sacrifice will feed me for decades to come." Pete made one last desperate attempt to save his friends. He grabbed a burning branch from the family's campfire and swung it at the nearest creature. The flames had an immediate effect. The thing shrieked and recoiled, its borrowed human face melting away to reveal something that hurt to look at directly. "Fire!" Pete shouted. "They're afraid of fire!" But there wasn't enough fire, there wasn't enough anything. The creatures swarmed over them like a tide of nightmares, and the last thing Pete remembered was that horrible, beautiful humming filling his head as something with too many teeth smiled down at him. The search and rescue teams found their campsite 3 days later. The tents were shredded, the supplies scattered, and there was no sign of the 6 friends except for some personal belongings and a camera with most of its film exposed. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead due to exposure and possible wild animal attack. But The camera contained one frame that the authorities never made public. It showed the clearing where the family had been camping, but in the photograph, the clearing was empty except for 6 figures hanging from the trees in cocoons of hair-like substance. The figures were clearly recognizable as Mark, Danny, Tommy, Sarah, Jake, and Pete. The photograph was filed away in a sealed folder marked Unexplained Phenomena Do Not Distribute. What the authorities didn't know, what they couldn't have known, is that the hunger had learned everything it needed from Mark's memories. Within a year of the incident, missing persons reports in major cities across North America began to spike. People would disappear from urban areas, leaving behind no trace except for the occasional report of beautiful humming heard in empty buildings or abandoned lots. The hunger was spreading, just as it had promised. It had found a way out of the forest, and sometimes late at night in cities like Toronto, New York, and Chicago, people report hearing that sound, that hauntingly beautiful humming that makes you want to follow it, no matter where it leads. They report seeing impossibly tall, thin figures in the shadows between buildings, figures that move with an unnatural gait and wear faces that seem almost, but not quite, human. If you ever hear that humming, if you ever see those figures, remember the story of Whispering Pine Hollow. Remember what happened to 6 experienced outdoorsmen who thought they knew everything about survival in the wilderness. And whatever you do, don't follow the sound, don't move toward it, because the hunger is always patient. And it's always looking for new prey. And there you have it, dear listeners, 3 true stories that remind us why Halloween has always belonged to the darkness, the Shepherd's Rest, still collecting souls on the Yorkshire moors. The house on Gallows Hill Road, where a centuries-old pact continues to claim the innocent, and somewhere in the wilderness of Algonquin Park, an ancient hunger that has learned to hunt in our modern world. These aren't just stories, they're warnings. They're reminders that no matter how safe we think we are, no matter how much we believe we've conquered the natural world with our technology and our cities, there are still things out there that hunger for us. Things that have been waiting far longer than we've been walking upright. So the next time you find yourself lost on a foggy country road, the next time you inherit a house with too much history, the next time you hear beautiful music coming from somewhere, it shouldn't remember these stories. Remember that some invitations are better declined, some doors are better left unopened, and some sounds are better left unfollowed. This has been Grudging Grace, and I'm your host, Angelina. Thank you for joining me in the darkness tonight. Sleep well, if you can. And remember, every shadow has a story, but some stories are better left untold. Until next time, keep your lights on and your doors locked, 'cause you never know what might be waiting in the dark.